Alright, what is up my homies? Welcome to Brain Melt University. I got a confession to make. This is my second attempt at recording this video. It turns out when you're trying to discuss something as broad and varied as cybersecurity and you have the attention span of a senile squirrel, you really have to write a script, and I normally do not do that with my videos. As a result, my previous 3 attempts at recording this video were all an incoherent mess of jumbled ideas, and while a lot of these concepts are extremely important to know about, I wasn't covering any concept with any degree of completeness or any level of knowledge that would really help a viewer. That's why I'm taking a step back, making a second attempt at recording this video, and going to take a lot smaller steps when it comes to discussing the concept of cybersecurity as it pertains to networks. With that said, if you find this video helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share with your friends, and comment down below. All of these things help the YouTube algorithm recommend us to more viewers and help us continue to be a resource for you in the future. One of the first steps of cybersecurity is actually taking a step back and looking at what the threats are. Anyone who's ever taken an entry-level business course knows about a SWOT analysis. A SWOT analysis is where you're looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. A threat is normally something that is beyond your control. All you can really do against a threat is to mitigate the chances that a threat can actually turn a vulnerability into an exploit. A vulnerability is a weakness in your defenses or just a weakness in how your organization operates, versus an exploit, which is the actual use of a vulnerability against a person or organization in order to cause harm to that person or organization. The first step of cybersecurity, or just risk management in general, is to identify what these threats are. If you work for an organization that happens to be a government contractor, you're going to have to look out for things like cyber espionage, which is cyber attacks being caused by foreign nation states in order to harm your nation's national security. If you work for an organization that might be socially questionable depending on where it's located, like running sweatshops or by underpaying your employees, you might have to deal with hacktivists, which are a group of hackers who also happen to just be activists. If you're a large organization that just exists to make money, then you're likely going to also have to deal with cyber criminals who generally are motivated by money. And if you are a government organization yourself, you're likely going to have to deal with cyber terrorism, which are cyber attacks being caused by people who have a political agenda. Everything that I've just described is not necessarily a threat. These are all examples of threat agents. It is important to keep in mind that there is a difference between a threat and a threat agent. A threat is the underlying concept or idea behind it. Cybercrime is the act. Cyber terrorism is an act. Cyber espionage is an act. But all of these acts require someone to enact them. How many times have I said act? Need more coffee. A threat agent is a person who has the ability to enact these threats against your organization. They're the physical person who is exploiting the vulnerabilities within your organization. When it comes to threat agents, you typically have an insider threat and an outsider threat. Outsider threats are all of these people I've just described. These are people outside your organization who are writing malware. These are the hacktivists who are trying to bring your organization's moral gray areas to the light. These are the cyber terrorists who are attempting to cause damage to your organization and create fear among the general populace in order to further their own political goals. These are the cyber spies who are bringing about cyber espionage, trying to damage your government's ability to do its job and service its own people. But an insider threat is a lot more difficult to work with. Insider threats are the people who work for our organization who have the ability to cause harm to it. Not everyone who works for an organization wants to cause that organization harm. If we're designing our building and our company culture correctly, then really we should have very few of these people. However, it is the ultimate form of naive to believe that no one would ever want to share our company's proprietary secrets or to cause damage to that company. Eventually, you're going to deal with people who do not have a strong moral center, and you're going to have to treat all of your employees, sadly, like they have that particular character flaw. This is why when we're dealing with insider threats, we need to take the path of least privilege into account. The principle of least privilege is where every individual who works for a specific organization is provided with the minimum amount of information to get their job done and no more. I've given analogies in my previous videos to this before, but say for instance, you're a person who works in the customer service department for an organization. You really shouldn't have access to the accounting information or the research and development information for that organization. And the same for any other individual. You need to have the information necessary to do your job, but you shouldn't have any information that is not necessary to do your job. Your supervisor working in the same customer service department might have more privileges than you, and you as an underling who might have a specialty in a specific area might actually have access to information that even your supervisor does not. There are other safeguards that you want to take into account when you're dealing with insider threats. One of these is to disable the ability for people to introduce outside information. This is delving into my next planned video for social engineering, but one of the greatest threat vectors for introducing malware into a network is not actually the internet, it's the employees within your company bringing stuff in that they shouldn't. One of the most famous malware attacks of all time, the Stuxnet attack, which basically disabled Iran's nuclear programs, was introduced into their network not from an outside computer network, but from an employee picking up a USB drive out of the parking lot and inserting that into one of their computers. They completely bypassed all of the security that was in place at the network's edge and introduced malware that ultimately destroyed Iran's plans for a nuclear apocalypse. It's usually a good idea as you're hardening your network, which is our ability to reduce the number of vulnerabilities in our network, is to disable input-output ports that are not in use, so disabling all USB ports that aren't necessary for the keyboard and mouse, and also to disable things like the DVD drive because, let's face it, it's the 2020s. No one uses DVDs anymore. Taking a small step back and getting back on topic, because we're already starting to go down rabbit holes that we really should save for other videos, we're normally assessing what these different threats are through what's called a risk assessment. A risk assessment is a task that your organization should be undergoing on a fairly regular basis. Your organization's risk assessment is there to assess what the different threats are, what vulnerabilities exist within your organization for those threats to actually enact themselves. Risk assessment is very similar to something called a security audit. However, security audits are normally being performed by third-party organizations, and usually these are being brought about to ensure that you are compliant with certain federal regulations or for different standards that you've been accredited for. If you fail to meet the standards set forth by these different laws, standards, and regulations, your organization could end up paying quite a hefty fine as a result. Therefore, it's a good idea to constantly do your risk assessments to ensure that you're not falling out of compliance with these different laws and regulations in order to make sure you don't end up failing a security audit. After you've performed a risk assessment, you need to take a look at your risk appetite. A risk appetite is how much risk you are willing to accept in any given computer network. There's always going to be risk when you're dealing with a computer network. You're never going to be able to completely make that network safe. The only way to make a computer network safe is by having everything just be a standalone computer system, and at that point, your ability to actually function as an organization is going to basically collapse in on itself. You're going to have to learn to accept certain risks as your organization pursues its mission and vision. Normally, this risk appetite has to take three things into account: how much of a risk this poses to your organization compared to the cost to reduce that risk, and compared to the detrimental effects it will have on the usability of that computer network. If there's a particular risk that poses a 1 in a million chance that someone can break into your network, and the cost of getting rid of that particular risk is to completely upgrade your entire switch infrastructure for your entire organization, then the cost probably isn't going to outweigh the benefit for that particular risk. So this is where you're going to have to do a balancing match, and you're going to have to fix as many vulnerabilities as possible within reason given the operating budget that you have available. If that 1 in a million chance of being pwned can actually be fixed with a simple software update that poses very little risk of causing additional instability in your network, of course your organization is going to want to just install those updates and get rid of that vulnerability. These are the types of checks and balances that you have to take into account as you're performing a risk assessment and as you're determining your organization's risk appetite. Your next step after performing a risk assessment is to actually take action. One of the things about cybersecurity is that there is a ton of terminology, and oftentimes it is a cyclical approach. First, you need to identify your threats, then you need to perform your risk assessment, then you need to begin hardening your network, and then you should preferably run a second risk assessment afterwards to make sure that no additional vulnerabilities have been created by your fixes. After all of that is done, you need to be on top of what's going on in the cybersecurity world, because if new threats present themselves, then your pre-existing risk assessments could be completely null and void, and you could have to completely redo the way your organization approaches cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is an ongoing process. It is not a one and done type of deal. Now, these risk assessments normally do not just focus on cybersecurity. There are a number of threats to your organization, such as natural disasters, future regulation, which might adversely affect your organization's ability to perform its work, and others that you're going to have to take into account that don't necessarily come into play when it comes to cybersecurity. And your organization should develop a comprehensive game plan for dealing with all of these threats, not just the cyber threats. A risk assessment might also take into account the fact that if you're an organization whose headquarters is in Florida, you're probably going to have to deal with hurricanes on a fairly regular basis. And where there's hurricanes, there's flooding and possible water damage to a lot of your organization. You might have to think about establishing a hot, cold, or warm site. These are backup sites that you can move a particular branch of your organization to in order to continue your business. A hot site is a backup site in which all of the computer systems necessary to operate your business are ready to go. They are brought up to the same standards as the regular headquarters, and everything might be a bit cramped, but your organization can operate for weeks or even months from this backup site while you're making the necessary repairs to your primary location. A warm site is very similar, but the computer systems might not necessarily have all of the software necessary to do their jobs. They might not be completely up to date with software updates, and they might not necessarily have all of the backups that you've been taking from your primary location installed on the primary computers. So it might take a few days to get this warm site up and operational versus the hot site that should be available in hours. A cold site is a backup location with very little ready to go. The computer systems might be on site, but they might not necessarily be plugged in and configured. They might not have any updates installed whatsoever. They might not have any of the backups implemented, and so it could take a few weeks to get a cold site up and operational. But the trade-off to all of these is cost. It is expensive to keep a warm site configured and operational, and it is especially expensive to keep a hot site ready to go, where this is an entire location that is not manned and is not generating any revenue for your organization while costing a great deal to maintain it. Again, this all comes down to the balancing act of what is the likelihood we'll need to use this location, what is the cost of implementing this update, and how effective is it actually going to be. If you're an organization located in, say, Nevada, you're not going to have to deal with tornadoes, you're not going to have to deal with hurricanes or flooding. Your organization is probably not going to need a hot, warm, or even a cold site in order to operate. However, that is something that your organization is going to have to come to grips with. And since I mentioned backups when I was discussing hot, warm, and cold sites, your backups are something that every organization should be implementing, because you never know if your organization is going to need backups because a server just has a hardware failure and loses all of its data, Or your organization could be hit by ransomware and you have a lot of systems that need to be completely re-imaged in order to operate properly. Your backups typically come in 3 flavors. You have a full backup, which is a complete backup of every piece of data and information on a specific computer system. You have an incremental backup, which backups all information that was created within a certain backup period. So if you have an incremental backup running once every day, then an incremental backup is going to back up all information that has changed or has been introduced into that computer system in the past 24 hours. A differential backup saves all information that has changed or has been created since the last full backup. So a comprehensive backup strategy might be to take a full backup of a computer system as it's first introduced to the organization, then do a daily incremental backup, which is just going to save everything that's changed that particular week. So you'll have 7 incremental backups in place. And then once a week, you're going to take a differential backup, which is going to save everything that has changed since the last full backup. Full backups, because they have so much information, are very space intensive. And so if you only ever take one full backup, and instead you have a daily small incremental backup, which is overwritten from week to week, and from week to week you have a differential backup, then this way, if you need to replace a computer system and install the backups, you install the full backup first, then you install the differential backup, and then you install every daily backup that has occurred since then. These all come into play when it comes to establishing a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan. And all of these are things that should be taken into account with a comprehensive risk assessment. But now that we've talked about threats, we've talked about threat agents, we've talked about your risk assessment as a whole, I think that we're going to have to take a step back and save the rest for another video, because I've already started going, once again, down more rabbit holes. And in order to keep this a nice, concise topic, I'm going to go ahead and break us off here. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to drop them in the comments below, and I'll see you all here next time on Brain Melt University.